Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. And I'm actually pleased to welcome Lee Munson, who will be joining me to present this webinar on really the rise and death and the rebirth of digital extortion. Lee?
Hello everyone, I'm Lee Munson and I'm a technical writer with McAfee.
Thank you very much, Lee. So as we begin to discuss the concept of ransomware, there's been a lot of discussion about the death of ransomware. In fact, I think, Lee, it was only maybe just 12 to 18 months ago that ransomware, or certainly predictions about cybersecurity, would suggest that ransomware died.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We thought it was gone for a while.
So today what we'll do is we'll actually talk about how this change has occurred and what specifically this means. But in addition to that, we're actually going to focus on one specific family. This is going to actually focus specifically on the business model associated with criminal enterprises focusing on digital extortion. And then I think most importantly, we're then going to focus on prevention tips and mitigation tips, in which you yourself can take tangible advice on how to protect yourself against these types of issues. Sound good, Lee?
That sounds good.
Fantastic. So you all remember the concept of ransomware. In fact, we can probably go back an extra 20 years, because I think it was the early 90s in which a white paper came out talking about the use of encryption as a means for potentially conducting such attacks. In fact, the theoretical notion of ransomware goes back well over 2 decades now. But in fairness, it wasn't really until, I guess, 2012, 2013 that we began to see this theory come to light. For those of you that may remember Operation Tovar, which was conducted by law enforcement agencies, in that particular instance, CryptoLocker was probably the first major types of attacks that we saw. So CryptoLocker itself was, and actually fundamentally, the early iterations of ransomware were, we can call them predominantly consumer-led threats. In other words, large collections of email addresses are collected, and those email addresses are then being used to disseminate and target organized individuals all across the world. It was like casting a big net out across the world and just hoping that somebody would click and open that. But of course, what we see in these types of certainly successful attacks, the industry responds and then the adversary fights right back again. And so CryptoLocker was the first, but all of a sudden we began to see a spate of new ransomware variants, the likes of CryptoWall or CTB Locker, for example, the Crypto Tor CT, right? And then Cerber, Locky, as well as Tesla Crypt and many, many others. And of course, it was a fairly simple approach. The approach was individuals get emails, they click on emails, it downloads or it basically infects them with ransomware. The ransomware is then used to encrypt data on the victim's computer, and subsequently they then have to pay a ransom. When they pay a ransom, they get their data back. That was the modus operandi. And then all of a sudden everything changed with WannaCry. WannaCry is and was certainly very different in that even when you paid the adversary, you didn't necessarily get your data back. I think even today, the number of companies that got their data back following a WannaCry infection is effectively a handful. What we focus on now, moving on from WannaCry, is we'll focus specifically on gantt, but also we'll have a brief touch upon Ryuk. This is a new variant. I say new variant, it's actually based upon the Hermes ransomware. And this particular one is really nasty because it is very, very targeted and really a far cry from what we've seen in the past.
That's right, yes.
In terms of protecting and fighting against these threats, we have to remember that, traditionally we've always focused on a signature-based approach. over the last number of years, we've begun to see the cybersecurity industry develop specific anti-ransom technology. And of course, we'll give you a free, if you stay till the end, you'll basically have a resource which will allow you to decrypt your data against well over 100 variants of ransomware, and it's free of charge. You don't have to give us your email address, and we won't even log your IP. Everything is provided free of charge on that one. So that's your incentive to stay till the bitter end. And if you don't give us 5-star reviews, we'll end up taking it back. You know, as I mentioned, one of the fundamental shifts that we've seen is ransomware predominantly was, you know, very, very untargeted. It was large swathes of email addresses, and it wasn't targeted in any way, shape, or form. What I think we see today, and certainly, you know, the volume of ransomware may well be lower than it was previously, as you saw in the earlier graph, but it is very much an enterprise threat. In fact, not only is it an enterprise threat, you could argue that the tools and techniques that are used are slightly, and I use the word slightly there intentionally, slightly more sophisticated in terms of initial entry vector. In particular, we could argue, and you know, for those of you that really aren't aware of RDP, you definitely need to if you're protecting an environment. The Remote Desktop Protocol by Microsoft, which operates on TCP 3389, this is a predominantly favorable tactic and technique to get inside an organization, and that's interesting because now all of a sudden, not only is it just an email coming into the inbox, but there's some degree of manual scanning, manual reconnaissance, and some attempt to get into the environment. Of course, once they're in the environment, we'll see a degree of lateral movement. And really the purpose is to absolutely put the boot onto the throat of companies by absolutely identifying the key points in an organization to really force them to pay. And that allows them to charge more money because, you know, whereas previously it was a couple of $100, with Ryuk, you know, a ransom demand can actually be 6 figures. And now, of course, with Matrix as well, we're seeing this type of tactic becoming very prevalent.
That's right. We've definitely seen a move away from the old personal ransomware that charged a tiny fraction of a Bitcoin to possibly retrieve your data.
Exactly. Now, one of the questions you'll ask is, well, how do they know about my OpenRDP ports? Actually, and here's a little bonus point for you all, is there are a number of shops on the dark web, as you'd expect, but these shops are actually selling RDP access into organizations, or really rather into systems, and the price of access into organizations can be, as you can see here, about $10. So for about $10, you can get inside a company. In this particular instance here, you can get admin rights, and then all of a sudden they're in. So it's not, as I said, I use the word slightly more sophisticated. I mean, it is slightly more sophisticated than hitting send, but it's not that much more sophisticated. So you know, be aware, this is not the most prevalent. Really, this is low-hanging fruit type of attacks.
Yeah, this is no problem to somebody who knows how to use Google and the dark web a little bit, right?
Exactly. So let's have a look at the rise of targeted ransomware. And actually, it's not as simple as what we saw in the past. You know, whereas historically just buying email addresses and hoping for a click-through rate of 0.5%, in this instance, the ransomware operators themselves conduct reconnaissance. In other words, they look and identify the victims that they want to go after. Historically, and certainly as you read about, they look to find organizations or industry verticals that they believe will pay. In this instance, the medical industry has been very badly damaged because they know that if a hospital gets hit, they're not going to be able to provide patient care, so they're more likely to pay. And there's been a large number of hospitals all across the world that have been impacted directly from these targeted types of attacks, all across the world, by the way. Once they've actually identified the target, what they will then do is conduct targeted delivery. And as I mentioned earlier, targeted delivery doesn't have to be just an email-borne threat. In fact, it can be a RDP-based attack. And then, of course, once they're in the environment, what's more relevant here is that we see a higher ransom being charged. And like I mentioned, this can be a six-figure demand as well. But in fact, there have been much higher demands in the past. In many cases, or in certain cases, they are willing to negotiate. Interestingly enough, the Ryuk gang, what we've seen is two different campaigns. One campaign, or rather based upon the extortion demand, we could argue that there are two groups. One group are willing to negotiate and the other one is not willing to negotiate. Kind of sounds like a Mel Gibson movie, doesn't it?
Yes.
One does not negotiate and the other one is willing to negotiate. What movie was that? I think that was
that one of the Lethal Weapons?
No, I don't think so. We'll have to look that up. Maybe somebody in the comments can remind us of what that is.
That's one where his kid gets kidnapped.
That's the one, yeah. So, we talk about the cybersecurity industry getting together and collaborating. We've done that as an industry. But that also applies to cyber criminals. And in this particular instance, we saw an RFP process being run by the Gantt crab crew. They actually put a call out to find a crypto service. And in this particular instance, the NT crypt thread, somebody actually, or rather a group of criminals actually put their hands up and developed some of the capability for gantt crab. And so this is really intriguing because, we talk about research and innovation, we talk about development, we talk about us as an industry, but getting better to find a way to combat these types of threats. But also we have to recognize and appreciate that the criminals are doing this as well. And in fact, we see a level of innovation. And as you've seen earlier with CryptoLocker to where we are today with Ryuk, really the approach and mannerism in which they're doing this has changed because they are working, collaborating, they're investing, everything they're doing is built with the sole purpose of extorting more money and building a better product.
And I think it would be fair to say that the bad guys are way, way better at working together and developing new resources and new attacks than the security industry is at coming together to stop them.
So that was Mr. Lee Munson that made that statement. So
in my opinion.
In Lee's opinion. So yeah. Agree or disagree, I think is probably the statement there, I would say. And of course, we've seen new exploit kits being developed. In this particular instance, Fallout, the exploit kit. And these are really new collaborations, new delivery tactics, and to be able to conduct the spread of ransomware. So very much you're dealing with a threat that is evolving, that is adapting, that is innovating, that is moving forward at such a rate and a pace. And it's imperative that you need to stay ahead of this. I mean, just today, for example, the RDP vulnerability entitled Bluekeep, there are still 1 million computers publicly accessible and vulnerable to that particular issue, even though a patch was released last week. And I can tell you, once a working exploit is into the hands of criminals, we will see an attack exploiting that. Mark my words. I'll wait for Lee to disagree with me now.
No.
So let's look at the model that these developers do. So you have the operators, or rather the developers of the software. Now, when I started in this industry, people would say, cyber criminals, they live in their mum's basement, they wear a hoodie. Well, I think that's actually insulting. The reality is that this is a organizational structure designed specifically for the extortion of money, and everything, the modeling for all of this is designed to extort as much money as possible. So the developers themselves create the ransomware. But actually what you now have is you have this affiliate program. And in other words, what that means is that individuals have the opportunity to be able to join the ransomware world. Let's say, for example, that you don't have the necessary skills to conduct a ransomware operation. Well, you don't have to worry, because now you can become an affiliate. And as an affiliate, you have the opportunity to be able to get a management dashboard, to be able to have a nice, beautiful graphical user interface that helps you solely conduct attacks. You don't have to develop the code. And generally speaking, you don't have to pay any money up front. You just they take a cut of your profits. And this, I would argue, is the biggest driver towards cybercrime. Just how simple it's become for anybody with access to a browser to conduct these attacks. I mean, I laugh, but I remember my 11-year-old daughter had the opportunity to conduct these attacks because she knows how to use the dark web. I mean, that's how simple it has become.
There's virtually no barrier to entry.
No, you're absolutely right. And of course, the affiliates will then be the ones that attack the victims themselves. So it's not as simple as who wrote the ransomware. Actually, there's an entire economy focused around this. So let's look at one, shall we? Let's look at the wonderful people over at Gantt Crab Inc. The Gantt Crab crew have been, I want to be careful the word I use, confrontational.
That's a good word.
Yeah. They've been confrontational. They have been out there and constantly developing new iterations of Gantt Crab as the industry responds and disrupts their environment. It was released last year. I think it was January. And we're now at version, oh gosh, I'm going to get this wrong. I've been out of the loop. I think the last I saw was 504, but we might be at 505, but certainly 504. And they're moving really quickly. I mean, I remember when we worked on actually one of our partners developed a decryptor on 503, and within hours we saw a new iteration of 504. They are constantly adapting, they are constantly evolving, and they are constantly innovating. And that's important because any misconception that you're protected against, let's say, Gantt Crab needs to be put to one side because the version numbers change all of the time. So how do we prepare a crab? We first need to find it, we need to weigh it, and then you can prepare it. So let's have a look how we prepare a Gantt Crab ransomware. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to pull it apart. And this is what we actually do. We actually completely tear it apart, and that allows us the opportunity to understand the details of how the Gantt Crab works. And in this instance, as you can see, it has multiple infection vectors from PowerShell scripts to botnets, exploit kits, which we discussed, Trojanized programs, phishing, and RDP. So they can find multiple ways to get into the environment. Now, of course, with version 5, they do lots of things. They check the installed languages, they encrypt with 5 random letters as the extension, they also store the value in the registry, they also create the wallpaper, and they deliver the ransom note. What that means is that the affiliates then have a very, very highly powerful piece of software that allows them to target victims all across the world. And in this particular instance, as you can see, the number of countries are very well spread out across the world, everywhere from India to Hong Kong to the United Kingdom and to the United States. Sadly, it looks like the UK and the US are probably the most impacted, but that's not hardly surprising. Now, if you run a ransomware development tool, one of the things that you're going to need to do is establish how much money you're going to make. And of course, if, for example, we have, let's say, Raj and Lee Gantt Crab crew. If I write the ransomware, I need to know how much money Lee's going to pay me. Now, I can rely on Lee and say, hey, Lee, how many people did you infect? And if Lee infected 100 people, I could expect the money from 100 infections. But these are criminals. Lee's not necessarily going to tell the truth.
Oh, thanks.
Hypothetically, actually, just to be clear, he's completely trustworthy in real life. So one of the things that they've done is establish an accounting capability. And so in this particular instance, they actually label everything just like we do in the real world with crabs. And so now what you'll find in a sub ID, you'll actually identify affiliate IDs associated with each and every single infection. So as you can see in this particular instance here, I know the individual affiliates that are sending out and infecting computers all across the world. Now that's imperative for me, because if I ask Lee, how many systems have you infected? He's going to know my voice, or at least get an email address, but maybe I can just do this automatically. And this is really interesting, because as we hunt for samples, we have over 280 samples associated with this. But now we have the opportunity to be able to identify the individual affiliate that is causing the infection on a per system basis. And from a law enforcement perspective, this is imperative. It allows us the opportunity to be able to identify the individual or individuals that are responsible for creating damage and economic loss to victims, which in turn is important for us to be able to do to support law enforcement investigations. And that is absolutely what we do for multiple investigations. And by the way, it's a huge list. This is just a snapshot. Did you all remember that? Good. I hope you get the screenshot for that. So what do we do, Lee? How do we actually begin to fight back?
Well, the No More Ransom initiative is a great start. Basically, it's a coming together of several different companies that allows people to get the decryption tools completely free of charge.
Exactly. So we co-founded this initiative. It was 2016, and we did so with Kaspersky Lab, Amazon Web Services, the Dutch National High-Tech Crime Unit, and Europol. And it was hosted free of charge by Amazon Web Services and Barracuda. Now, the website is nomoreransom.org. I'm guessing everybody's rolling their eyes because they've heard of this, but if you haven't, make a note of that URL, nomoreransom.org. Like Lee said, if you're infected with ransomware, you have two options: pay criminals, lose your data. If you're like me, you're never satisfied with the first response anybody gives you, so you develop ways to find a third option. And No More Ransom allows you the opportunity to get your data back without paying adversaries, if a key exists for the variant that you have been infected with. Of course, the adversary doesn't like that, and in the first iteration of gantt, they created a command and control server with the name nomoreransom.bit, as well as one of our key partners, Bleeping Computer. By the way, also a phenomenal resource for tremendous advice, as well as decryption tools and so forth associated with ransomware. But these are definitely the two links, not the bit, by the way, bleepingcomputer.com and nomoreransom.org. Those are the two that you're going to need to remember. And of course, this is all, we've been slightly tongue-in-cheek, but we do need to recognize that, the impact of ransomware has an enormous impact on availability of critical services. As we see here, this was actually a comment that was made on the BBC article associated with WannaCry. This impacted patient care. Now, I say the words impacted patient care, but what that actually means is that if you can cast your mind back to a point in which you or your family member needed urgent medical care, and the doctors do everything they can to help you. But just imagine, there are some people in this world that walk into an A&E or rush into an A&E and are told, I'm sorry, but we can't see you or we can't treat you because somebody clicked on an email, for example. So there is a very real and serious undertone associated with this. The attacks on ransomware are causing damage to our way of life. And it's important that, for those of you that were here, I'm delighted that you're here. Please take the advice to start to put mitigation and protection in place. But like I said, we've prevented over $22 million going into the hands of criminals. We have over well over 100 partners all across the world, from law enforcement, public sector to private industry. And we've got over 80,000 computers protected and decrypted so far. Not protected, sorry, decrypted so far.
And I think one final note is, as great as No More Ransom is, you don't want that to be your last hope. So also have a great backup strategy in place and test your backups.
Yeah, backup, and backup. Oh, sorry. Okay. So thank you. I'm at Raj_Samani on Twitter, and Lee.
I'm at security_FAQS.
We hope you enjoyed that, and now we will open up for questions.